Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I've got an exciting episode for you today, I think, all about humanoids, and in fact, the title of today's episode is called Don't Be Scared, 10 Very Strange Humanoid Encounters. Humanoid encounters are by nature strange, but these are particularly unusual. They've got some really unique elements, and I think each of these cases has something to offer in terms of our understanding of the extraterrestrial presence on this planet. All different types of humanoids, cases coming from all over the world, dating back to 1962 to 2023. Got 6 cases from the United States and 4 from outside, including from Italy, Spain, Japan, and Brazil, and in the United States, Alaska, Nebraska, New Mexico, New York, North Dakota, and the state of Washington. I think you'll find these cases really interesting, and most, I'm guessing, you probably haven't heard before. So let's just get started. In the first case I'd like to talk about today, I Beheld an Incredible Thing. This one occurred on December 17, 1962 in Milan, Italy. I find this case interesting because the witness is a night watchman. Quite a few cases of night watchmen seeing UFOs, probably because they're outside all the time. But it's also interesting in its location, right in the middle of a very crowded city. The night watchman is not the only witness, so this would be considered a multiple witness case. Another interesting thing to me is that this case involves a UFO pretty much landing and humanoids coming out, approaching the witness, and then going right back in. This is a pattern we see quite a bit. Again, it was on the evening of December 17, 1962 at precisely 2:20 a.m. that Francesco Rizzi, age 36, was making his rounds as a security guard or a night watchman at the Cascami textile plant located in the very heart of Milan, Italy. This is on Via Santa Valeria Street, you can see it here, immediately adjacent to the Sant'Ambrosia Square. And he was walking across the courtyard when he heard what he described as, quote, a whistling, swishing noise, and this was to his right. And as Francesco says in his own words, at first I thought it was in my ear, but then I noticed that the swish grew stronger and stronger. I therefore turned around and I beheld an incredible thing. There it was, just in front of me, hanging about 3 feet above the ground. It was of a clear metal, perhaps aluminum, with silver reflections on it. Its diameter may have been 12 to 15 feet, and on top there was a turret, around which were a number of lighted dormer windows. I was paralyzed and tried hard to believe my own eyes when suddenly the noise stopped. A brilliant greenish light was pouring from the 3 windows on the conning tower. I saw 2 strange-looking creatures inside it. At the bottom of the disc, a door was opened through which a little man came out, a little man of about 1 meter tall. I could not see him very well because it was very dark in the courtyard, and the man's head seemed to be absolutely black. To make matters worse, he wore a kind of luminous overall which made it hard to see him clearly. Now, per Francesco, the shape of the craft reminded him a little bit of an English helmet. He said the figure's suit appeared to be silvery, fluorescent, and was emitting a bluish light. The blackness of his head, he believed, was actually a helmet, and Francesco said it was his own emotion of fear which rendered him unable to move. And as he says, the man perhaps had no hostile intentions. He pointed 1 finger towards my hand, and with his other hand he gave me a sign to come nearer and not to be afraid. Yet I was completely unable to move. Soon after, another man jumped out of the disc, submerged in a blue haze. With a commanding gesture, he made a sign to the other to re-enter the disc. The first creature looked at me for a moment and then got back into the saucer. Suddenly the door closed behind them both, the swishing noise started again, and the disc took off vertically and disappeared in a cloud of white smoke. So now that the craft and humanoids were gone, Francesco recovered his mobility and he rushed out of the courtyard and immediately told another night watchman what he had seen. His co-employee told him to go report the incident to their superior, a man by the name of Mr. Pochentesta, which of course he did. And together, Francesco and Mr. Pochentesta went to the police. The police immediately arrived on the scene, but were unable to find any evidence of the craft. Francesco later spoke with reporters, saying, "Of course I had read about flying saucers and Martians coming to visit us and to spy on us, and also about messages coming from other worlds. But I would never have imagined that it would fall to my lot to see such an object under my nose. But I saw the Martians as I see you." Though Francesco's report was published widely in newspapers and later in a number of books, he received a great deal of publicity. And as a result of all this publicity, several people came forward and said that they had seen a strange flying object above Milan on the same night of Rizzi's sighting. Now, despite all this, all the publicity resulted in Francesco Rizzi being fired from his job. But he did have his supporters. Walter Chiari, a very well-known Italian movie star, actually went on TV and spoke about Francesco's experience, wished him a happy new year, and asked that Francesco Rizzi get his job back, saying, quote, "You can't fire a man only because he happened to see a flying saucer." Unfortunately, Francesco's employers were not convinced and he was not rehired. But as Francesco Rizzi's wife says, "Nobody believes my husband, but I know it's true. He doesn't drink and has always ridiculed stories of flying saucers." The case created quite a sensation when it occurred, as we can see, and obviously affected the witness profoundly. It's a really interesting case with all these weird patterns that we see. Like, why would these ETs come down and just step out of the craft for such a brief moment, as if to just say hello to a person? I don't know. There's a lot of cases like it though. But this next case is very unusual. Don't know if you've heard of this one before, but it actually involves a series of really amazing events and several humanoid encounters. I call this one A Nice Little Man. This one occurred through October and November of 1965 in Mogi Guaçu in Brazil. Multiple people saw this, and in fact there are thousands of witnesses to the UFO activity, a much smaller amount to some of these humanoid encounters. But these are some really interesting humanoid encounters with not your typical grays, certainly. Short little human-looking beings. So it's a fascinating case on many levels. This case, yes, involves a great number of witnesses and a series of really incredible humanoid sightings over a 2-month period in October and November of 1965. These were reported on by Coral and Jim Lorenzen, who spoke to Olavo T. Fontes, their representative for Brazil, and was also investigated by many other researchers, including Walter K. Buehler, Professor Flavio Pereira, Drs. Leo Godoy Otero, and Renato Bacelar. This case was published in both the APRO Bulletin and the Brazilian publication SBEDV, among other places. There were so many reports involved with this one from so many people that the dates have become somewhat confused, but starting in late October, numerous people in this area saw strange objects hovering and maneuvering over Mogi Guaçu, Brazil, but particularly over the huge farm complex owned by Dario Anhua Filho. He's a chemist who lived just outside of Mogi Guaçu. This is in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It was around 10 p.m. on October 18, 1965, that Dario Filho was on his property when he saw this sparkling orange object hovering about 100 meters, 300 feet over his farmhouse. And he described it as, quote, floating like a leaf and, quote, swinging like a pendulum. Immediately he saw 2 other objects, both of which immediately zoomed upwards to about 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet and switched off their lights. So he called out his wife Lucia and his grandson Darinho, age 10, and all three of them watched these objects fluttering in a falling leaf motion and then disappear so low over the treetops that it looked like they would almost strike the branches. They did notice a pleasant odor, and this kept coming up when these UFOs would appear because they appeared over and over again. They wondered if this odor might be something to do with the leaves being affected by the craft. At any rate, lots of people were seeing stuff at this time. It was one evening in October 1965 that 17-year-old Aparecida Correa da Silva and her cousin Nide saw a green light pass over their house and actually land in the yard of a large warehouse next to their home. You can see the sighting location here. They said this object was round, glowing, and had three wheel-like protrusions on the bottom. And they said that three humanoid figures, just over 1 meter tall, 3 feet, came out and started to bend down and seemed to be collecting samples of something from the ground. Now the craft was so bright, the witnesses could see that the humanoids were wearing one-piece blue coveralls and had stout bodies. They had clear skin, but 2 of them looked more tan than the others, and they were all wearing large transparent helmets. Somebody else nearby also saw all of this happening and actually approached the landed craft and humanoids, at which point the humanoids immediately entered the object through a small hatch. This craft rose vertically upwards and was gone. The very next night, this family saw a glowing green object pass over their house again, only this time it moved off into the distance. So around this time, the UFOs started to be seen nightly over Mogi Guasu, and people were gathering in large crowds to watch the activity. In fact, one evening, this is late October, police officer João Otaviano Ribeiro Neto and his co-worker Sebastião Andrade da Silva went to investigate, and they came upon a crowd of, they estimate, 1,000 people who were collected near a ceramics factory. They parked away from the crowd and were watching and observing and actually joking about the flying saucers when the joke was on them, because suddenly there was a luminous object descending lower near the ground, disc-shaped. They chased after it, lost sight of it, but then they later saw it floating at treetop level just south of Mogi Guasu over Mogi Marim, immediately to the south. And that's just one incident. There are many. Another case involved a doctor, Dr. Oswaldo Rangel Cardoso, who said that he and another person were followed down the road by a flying saucer. Another witness was Jaime Bueno. He owned a fish restaurant, and he said that he and his son were awakened at 3 a.m. by an object that was so intensely bright it lit up the whole area, including the interior of their house. It was just outside their home, about 20 meters above the ground, 60 feet, and they watched it for about 2 hours when it finally rose up silently. 2 days later, they saw it again, and of course they learned that many other people in their neighborhood had also seen it. On the night of October 30, 1965, a night watchman at that same ceramics factory noticed a light on the premises, so he went to investigate, and he saw that it was a very large, glowing, disc-shaped object which was floating by the large chimney towers. So he watched it as it moved towards the high voltage wires at the edge of the field, but then it started to head straight towards him. This scared him badly, and he made a dash for the inside of the factory and actually locked himself inside. Now back to the farm of Dario Filho. On November 11th, he headed to town on business, but upon returning home, he found his wife Lucia in hysterics. She said that around 9 p.m., she and their grandson, again Darinho, they both saw this silent orange light approaching the farmhouse right above the treetops. This had been going on for weeks, but on this occasion, without warning, the object dropped down and hovered about a half meter, just 1.5 feet above the ground, sort of landing in the cattle pen. It was moving back and forth. Now they were afraid because of all these previous sightings over the farm and the surrounding areas. They were both very nervous, but both Lucia and Darinho approached the gate to the cattle pen, and about 40 meters away, 120 feet, they could see this object. which they described as being about 3 to 4 meters wide and 3 meters high. That's about 9 to 12 feet wide and 9 feet high. They said it was roughly cone-shaped. They could see a tube extending from one side of the object, and it was radiating sparks. But they immediately noticed a little man who was wearing gray clothes with kind of white spots on it. And this little man was walking among the cattle, who were not reacting, and heading towards a mango tree. Now, the object disappeared at one point, so did the little man, but 5 minutes later the craft reappeared in the same exact spot, and another figure emerged, identical to the first except wearing a white shirt and brown pants. And they could now see them clearly enough to discern delicate facial features, or as she says, he had a very cute little face. She said that he was, quote, a nice little man. I will never forget his face. So this little man proceeded to go back and forth about 4 or 5 times over to the jurubeba tree and was collecting twigs, leaves, and branches, apparently from this tree, and carrying them in his arms back to the craft. It turns out this is a medicinal plant, widely used for a number of reasons. And there were 2 other figures. Occasional people would pass by the area because there was a wedding going on nearby, but each time anybody appeared, the figures would quickly enter the craft, going up this green-colored tube on the side, and the craft would move behind bushes, apparently to hide. One of the 3 figures during all this time would stand by the fence and seem to be studying the family's mare. So after about 5 minutes of this, the object left, but it was just that there was more sightings going on. Lucia and Dorinho now saw 2 more glowing UFOs appear, and one of them sent down a beam of light onto this rough wooden post, sort of pillar. And in the beam, Lucia could see an image, or what looked like a projection, of a little man standing with his arms outstretched, kind of like he was holding a steering wheel or something, and he was staring fixedly at the house. She said this man had a light complexion, a bald head, and was wearing a cream-colored coverall. At one point, Dorinho approached, and this would cause the beam to become darkened. Finally, the beam of light stopped, and this object sent out a beam of light to the other object, which kind of rolled out like a staircase, is how Lucia described it. One of the short figures used what looked like a flashlight-like instrument, turned on a green light. Immediately there was the sound of an explosion and a bright flash, and both objects disappeared. At that very same moment, all the kerosene lamps in the house went out, and the covers on the lamps actually broke. Now they tried to light them with matches, but even the matches wouldn't work. And they found out that their battery-powered flashlights were also inoperable. The next day, November 12, Dario checked the area where Lucia had seen the little man, and he found the fresh broken branches on the jurubeba tree. Again, this is a well-known medicinal plant used to treat liver, digestive health, anemia, and other inflammatory conditions. So, having this happen, Dario decided to go to town and tell his friends and work associates about all this activity. Told them that this craft would sometimes follow his car to the farm, and he implored them to come the next evening to help him investigate this ongoing activity. So the next night arrived, November 13, 1965, and sure enough, this object reappeared. Dario and his son Salvador actually saw it first. They called over everybody to watch, and a whole bunch of people saw this, including the director of the local bank, Gilberto Rocha da Silveira, and the family priest, Longino Vartbinden, and several neighbors. And they all watched this object hover and then land about 30 meters, almost 100 feet away. The object immediately sent a beam upwards. Now the bank manager had a camera ready, but he was so shocked he actually dropped it and did not take any photographs. But at this point, 2 short figures, described as being the size of a 7-year-old child, were seen. One was wearing overalls, the other had what looked like a gray shirt and brown pants, and a third entity was also seen in the beam of light. It was described as having a squarish, flattish head and was wearing what looked like a surgeon's apron. All 3 of these figures were glowing brightly. Now this event was also viewed by other people. There was a sheriff and a police clerk driving by, and they actually stopped and watched this. Numerous other witnesses also saw the craft and the beings, including the mayor, the chief of police, and dozens of people who lived near the farm. After just a short period of time, these beings got back into their craft, which took off at high speed. But events weren't over yet. Later that same night, a couple was driving from Nova Luzon to Moji Miram, again only a few miles away from this location, when they came upon a huge light blocking the road in front of them. So they turned around and immediately encountered a truck who was heading in this direction and warned him about the light in the middle of the road. And as they were doing this, a third car drove by them towards the light, but of course quickly turned around and joined them. So now all of these people in 3 separate vehicles drove slowly together in a convoy approaching this light, and as they got close, it suddenly soared upwards. The 3 vehicles stopped at the junction of the highways at Pinhal, where there was a gasoline station, and numerous people had gathered there, dozens of people, and the whole crowd of people observed this object floating in the sky and then finally darting away. It was 1 month later that Dario reported one more sighting of an object with a dome hovering in the night sky over his farm, but it was also learned that 6 months earlier, Dario's son Salvador and the farm foreman Avelino Ribeiro Prado were repairing a fence on the farm when they saw 2 very short figures off in the distance. These figures were gesticulating and walking quickly, urgently, for about 5 to 10 minutes. They were wearing one-piece white jumpsuits. Now both Salvador and Avelino assumed that these were people, thieves perhaps, trying to steal wood. So they approached from different routes, intending to surprise these little guys, but when they arrived, nobody was there. What's interesting to me about that case is that it occurred during such an intense wave of UFO activity. So many witnesses, quite a few people seeing these little humanoids. It's like, what are they doing? In one of the main cases, it's quite obvious what they're doing. They're collecting samples. I found it quite interesting that they were collecting samples of a well-known medicinal plant. So maybe they are using plants for the same reasons we are. Hard to say for sure, but yeah, lots of interesting details to that one. And here's another case that I found particularly compelling. I call this one, I Will Deny It. This is another multiple witness case which occurred one evening in October 1968 outside of the small town of Hastings in North Dakota. I like this case. In some ways it's pretty typical, but it's also got some really interesting elements to it in that this UFO was seen very close up. These gray type ETs looking down at the witnesses. And also very interesting is that this craft paced their car for some miles. Most interesting to me is how at least one of the witnesses reacted. This case involves 4 witnesses, but as of today only one has come forward, and she has requested anonymity. I'll call her Suzanne. At the time of her encounter, Suzanne was in high school, and it was around 8:30 p.m. one crisp, clear evening in October that Suzanne, her sister, and another high school student and their pastor were driving home from a church youth meeting in Valley City, North Dakota, heading south towards their home in Litchville. The pastor was driving. This was a drive of about 27 miles, and they were approximately 10 miles from their home, just a few miles north of Hastings, when Suzanne and her sister, who were both sitting in the back seat, noticed something very unusual. And you can see the exact location here. As Suzanne says, I glanced out the left passenger window and saw a silver metallic disc rise noiselessly from behind a small grove of deciduous trees. I could see lights through the trees, and suddenly the lights began to rise. And then, there it was, a UFO, hovering just above the trees. The disc hung there, not moving, silent. So Suzanne immediately shouted out, "There's a UFO!" And both she and her sister looked at it with, quote, great excitement. Now, strangely, the girl in the front passenger seat did not acknowledge what was happening in any way, and she actually refused to even look. The pastor who was driving also said nothing and did not appear to react. But then something amazing happened. As Suzanne says, As we watched, the disc moved laterally, stopping over the car no more than 30 feet above us to our left and a little ahead of us. It was shiny and metallic, but more of a dull shine, not like silver. The bottom half looked like a shallow bowl. The top half looked like an inverted shallow bowl, but there was a higher dome in the middle. There were red and green flashing lights alternating around the edge of the rim, and there were also white flashing lights, but I cannot recall the exact configuration. There were also windows visible in the higher raised dome, and there was a glow of light coming from inside the UFO's interior. As we traveled along the highway, it kept perfect pace with us. My sister and I crowded in the window and craned our necks to watch it. I could see the clear silhouettes of figures backlit in some of the windows. In one window, it appeared like several figures were standing together, as though they were trying to get a good look at us. So at this point, Suzanne shouted out, "They're watching us!" This object was continuing to keep pace with them, and it was close enough that they were able to make out some details of these beings' appearance. As Suzanne says, "I remember saying to my sister that the figures were shorter than us. I am 5 feet 4 inches, because the dome was low. The figures looked grayish, and their heads looked big compared to their bodies and arms. The windows were tall enough that I could see their heads and their torsos." Suzanne told her sister, "Look how short they are." Earlier, Suzanne had read the book The Interrupted Journey by John G. Fuller about the Betty and Barney Hill encounter, and this made her very interested in this subject. So she was incredibly excited to realize that they were not only seeing a UFO and the beings, but that it was so close to them. And Suzanne said out loud, "Maybe they want to make contact with us." And then she said out loud that she wanted to open the window and acknowledge them in some way. But at that moment, the pastor, who had been dead silent through the whole time, sharply ordered her, "Don't you dare. We are just going to keep on driving the same speed. Ignore it and don't do anything to attract its attention." Now Suzanne wasn't having this. As she says, "Despite his warning, my sister and I continued to huddle at her window, staring up at the UFO and the figures in the windows. It followed us for several miles, with the pastor driving a steady speed and staring straight ahead. As we neared the tiny town of Hastings, the UFO suddenly rose up and sped off at an angle to our right and accelerated at an astonishingly high rate of speed, disappearing to a small, distant light in the sky in mere seconds. I remember exclaiming how quickly it flew away. I was very excited about the experience, and I kept talking about how I couldn't believe we had just seen what we did. So at this point, Suzanne asked the girl in the front, "Can you believe we saw that?" And without even turning around, the girl replied, "I didn't see anything." At that, Suzanne and her sister just kind of stared at each other and rolled their eyes. A short time later, they arrived at the church in Litchville, where Suzanne's mother was waiting for them. Suzanne and her sister were both very excited to tell their mother about this amazing encounter. But before they could, the pastor ordered them not to get out of the car yet until he talked to them. And as Suzanne says, he ordered us not to speak one word of what had just happened. He specifically told us we were not to tell our parents about it. I argued with him a little and said we should be able to tell the truth. The pastor was not convinced, and he told them, "People will think I'm crazy if anyone hears about this. If you tell anyone about what we have seen, and I'm with you, I will deny it." So despite this, Suzanne and her sister, to their credit, rushed up to their mother and immediately told her the whole story. And her mother not only believed them, but said that she had herself seen strange lights in the sky over a farm just 1/4 mile from their home. 40 years later, Suzanne finally filed an official report, writing, "It is still vivid in my memory. At that time, few people talked about seeing UFOs. As for the other girl, I do not think I ever talked to her about it again, and I certainly did not talk to the pastor about it. I will never forget being that close to a UFO and seeing it so clearly. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life." How crazy is that? Here we have two sisters very excited about seeing this craft and wanting to make contact with the occupants, but the pastor and the other passenger clearly frightened and not wanting to make contact. I also found it kind of ironic that here we have a pastor who is, you would think, a very moral person, but literally told these witnesses to lie, withhold the truth. Just don't think that that's a good policy in any case. But I wasn't there, so I certainly don't want to judge anyone to how they react to an encounter, because it can be very frightening, as we've certainly seen over and over again. But an absolutely fascinating case. And now let's move to the next one, which is so unusual. I call this one No Satisfactory Explanation. This is another multiple witness case which occurred on October 1st, 1975 in Hakushu, Japan. This case does not involve any apparent UFO, and for that matter, these might not even be extraterrestrials as we think of them. It's a very unusual case with absolutely, really unusual elements that I don't know that I've ever heard quite before, certainly not in this way. But it was professionally investigated. By all accounts, it seems to be a legitimate event, which I think you'll find quite unusual. This very odd case comes from APRO's Japanese representative, Junichi Takanashi. He's a UFO researcher and the chairman of the Modern Space Flight Association of Osaka, Japan. This case involves two witnesses, Michio Hikawa, age 19, and his friend Takeshi Furuya, age 18. They lived in the small town of Hakushu, not far from the beautiful Southern Alps National Park in Osaka, Japan, and on October 1st, 1975, decided to take an evening drive in their father's 1971 Suzuki Fronte car. It was around 8 p.m. as they stopped in one of the parking lots to the park, which at that time was deserted. They were listening to the radio and talking when Takeshi noticed what he thought at first were small beggar children standing near the car, but they looked strange. Now Michio was very much surprised because when he looked, he couldn't see anything. But Takeshi was insistent. He said he not only saw short figures, but other figures who were no more than 3 feet tall, 1 meter, and were wearing white clothing and had glowing yellow eyes. They could barely be seen because it was quite dark out. And Takeshi could only say that they looked very strange, and he pointed them out to Michio, who could not see them. So it was so dark outside, so Michio turned on the headlights of the car, at which point the figures seemed to just fade away and disappear. Both young men were very confused, as they were sure that they were alone in this parking lot, because this area was quite remote, there were no homes in the area, there were no other cars. Now, suddenly it got even weirder, because without any warning, their vehicle was pulled rapidly and sharply backwards, several meters. It actually caused Takeshi to fall forward in his seat. Michio had his hands on the steering wheel, so he did not fall forward, but this happened twice. The car was pulled backwards several meters. So both the witnesses were very confused, because the parking brake on the car was actually on, and the parking lot was totally level. The car wasn't just rolling, it was clear that some sort of force was pulling on the car. So they were frightened. They started the car and drove back to town, and as they drove, Michio was the first to raise the possibility that perhaps these figures were, quote, spacemen. This surprised Takeshi, but he did confirm that these figures did not look normal, and said that at one point, one of these figures came right up to the car, and he saw what looked to him kind of like a cow's hoof rubbing on the glass window on his side of the car. So they quickly reached town, they told their friends and asked them to return with them, but all their friends refused. After several moments, their curiosity overcame their fear, and the two young men returned to this location. Only this time they did take the precaution of facing their car on the downslope near the exit, so they could make a quick getaway if they had to. But no sooner had they stopped, Michio still had his foot on the brakes, when the car was pulled backwards about 3 meters, 9 feet. Amazed, they opened their windows and looked at the wheels of the car, and sure enough, they were rotating in reverse. This was not an illusion. At this point, Takeshi decided to step out of the car to try and communicate to whoever was doing this. He called out in Japanese. There was no response. He tried calling out gibberish words, still no response, so he got back in the car and once again was instantly pulled backwards by this invisible force. This happened 3 more times, which frightened them, so they drove home and decided that they're not going to tell anyone. But it was the very next day. Michio was working with his father on the farm cutting crops, and his father saw him looking up into the sky and not really paying attention. And Michio actually cut himself, so he confessed to his father that he was thinking about the prior evening events and explained what happened. He really expected his father to ridicule him, but instead his father believed him, as earlier he had noticed some strange marks on the window of the car exactly where Michio had seen this hoof-like object actually touching the car. So together they went to examine the car, and after looking at it and trying it out, they discovered it was now in very poor condition. It was making strange noises, it wouldn't start. They checked the battery water and saw that it was half full, which was strange because they had just filled it 10 days earlier, and the car had been running smoothly. It was still pretty new, with only 28,000 kilometers on the odometer. So Coral Lorenzen writes in the APRO Journal about this case, and she says, "There is still no satisfactory explanation for the movement of the car, with the brakes applied, as described. There are no nearby homes, and the campground and parking area were unoccupied, which virtually eliminates human pranksters. There are wild monkeys in the vicinity, but it is doubtful that they could move the car. If monkeys were there, both youths should have been able to see them. There is no mention in this report that either youth saw anything resembling any type of UFO." That's another one of those kinds of cases that make you just go, like, what do you make of this? Was this ET? Could it have been spirits? Very hard to say, but with 2 witnesses and physical evidence, it's hard to deny that something did not happen. Something clearly happened to these boys. What it was? Well, I'm just portraying the facts as we know them. You can make up your own minds about it, but I do think it's an important case. And now let's move to the next one. This is another multiple witness case involving 2 young brothers who saw something together very unusual. I call this one Don't Be Scared. This is the case that actually inspired the title for this whole episode, because this is something so many ETs do tell people, and I certainly told the witness in this case. This one occurred one evening in winter of 1975 in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, and this one is absolutely unusual, and I think you'll find it very compelling. This case was reported to MUFON by the witness, who provided a first-hand testimony of an experience he had at age 6 or 7 years old. He is anonymous, so I'll call him David. At the time of his experience, he lived with his parents and 2 brothers in a rural area outside of Plattsmouth, Nebraska. This is about 15 miles west of Offutt Air Force Base in Bellevue, where his father worked. David shared a room with one of his brothers, and they slept in a bunk bed. His brother had the lower bunk, and David slept in the top one. And on this particular evening in 1975, winter, he was asleep and facing the wall. And then, as David says, and I quote, "All of a sudden, I woke up, still facing the wall, and I felt as if I was being watched. I slowly turned over, only to come face to face with something. Even though it was only 2 or 3 feet away from my face, I could not make out its face. I could only see an outline of a head and what appeared to be a cape extending out from both sides of its head. It reminded me of Dracula. Needless to say, I was petrified. But I heard or felt a voice say, 'Don't be scared. Turn back over.' So I did. Facing the wall again, I was wide awake and scared bleepless. But I don't know why I never called out for Mom or Dad. I don't know how much time passed, but I stayed looking at the wall and hoping whatever it was would just go away." So finally David summed up enough courage to turn around and look, and whatever had been next to his bed was now gone. In a split second, David leapt from his top bunk and into the lower bunk where his brother was sleeping, and pressed himself up against the wall. This of course awakened his brother, who wondered what the heck David was doing, and David told him, "Dracula was in our room." So this frightened his brother, and both of them hid under the covers, examining the room for anything. And it was at this point that they both heard a strange noise in the hallway, followed by silence. And as David says, what happened next, I will never forget. A big green head with big eyes peered around the corner and looked at us. Then it was gone. We slowly looked at each other as if to say, "Did you just see what I saw?" Needless to say, we spent the rest of the night huddled there awake and waited until daylight. The next morning they told their parents, who said it must have been just a dream, which of course David does not believe was the case, as he says. To this day, I don't know why we didn't scream bloody murder for our parents, as was the case when we would have a nightmare. The next morning they went outside and checked for footprints or any other evidence of the intruder, but found nothing. David did say that a few other strange things happened. He doesn't describe them, but he said that the bedroom visitation by this strange creature made a huge impression on him. Despite this, as time went on, the memory of this encounter began to fade, and as he grew older, he would think about the incident every now and then, but started to wonder if it was perhaps just a bad dream. But then, at age 16 or 17, something happened which, for him, confirmed this experience as being real. As David says, I happened upon a book in the library about UFOs and aliens. As I read it, I became engrossed and couldn't put it down, until I came to an artist's rendering of what is now the classic gray. Seeing that picture sent chills down my spine and scared me to where I put the book away, only to get it out later because I couldn't stop thinking about it, which brought me back to this night. Now, David has never seen a UFO, but the childhood encounter remains etched in his memory, and as he says, it has been haunting me ever since. As an adult, he did ask his brother about it, but all his brother could recall was that something scary happened. David showed him a drawing of a gray, but his brother didn't say anything, and as David says, he probably thought me to be crazy, so I haven't mentioned it since, even though I think about it time to time. I don't know if what I saw was an extraterrestrial, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't Dracula or Frankenstein. Now, interestingly, and perhaps significant, is that around this same time, and only 50 miles away, in Lincoln, Nebraska, there was another sighting. It was on October 31st. Two young boys were trick-or-treating and had just walked past their school and were in front of a house when they saw a massive UFO. As one of the witnesses says, we noticed this huge disc-shaped object with lights of different colors spinning around the disc. As it started to clear the housetops and we realized the size, bigger than the house we were walking up to, we were horrified. My friend ran up under the carport. I was too afraid the owners would find us and be mad, so I stayed out about 15 seconds more until it cleared the housetops and started moving slightly and very slowly south, scaring me enough to go to the carport. I ran back out from the carport just in time to see it hovering basically above us. I can't remember if there was any sound associated with it. Then once it cleared the trees, it shot into space and was gone. We were both horrified and decided it was a Halloween prank. Neither one of us ever mentioned it again to anybody or even to each other. But there is no way in 1975 that anyone could put together something of this magnitude. So it's an interesting sighting. It's impossible, obviously, to say for sure if these two events are related in any way, other than the fact that they occurred near the same area, near the same time. There are so many cases of witnesses who see ETs when they're very young, and my heart goes out to them. That has got to be quite a frightening encounter, especially when you don't really have any means to interpret what you're seeing. So we often do have witnesses waiting years to figure out what they saw, and only realizing it when they see perhaps an illustration of a gray ET or whatever type of ET they saw. So yeah, really amazing. It's that second case that is in the same area around the same time. That's also interesting to me. I suspect that most people who have encounters, there are other outside witnesses to them, but because so many people are afraid to talk about it, afraid to report it in any official way, we lose a lot of data. But the point is, there are a lot of cases of this kind. And now let's move to another one. This is another case that would have slid under the radar if the witnesses had not reported it. It's a multiple witness case. I call this one, Did You See What I Saw? This one occurred in May 1976 in Valdez, Alaska. This is a pretty small town, a very beautiful area. What I like about this case is not only does it have multiple witnesses, but this was a daylight sighting of a landed UFO and humanoids. Those are somewhat rare, and this one has got some very interesting details to it. This case involves two men, both anonymous. I'll call them Chuck and Patrick, and they had a very unusual experience in the small town of Valdez, Alaska. This town has about 3,500 to 4,000 people, and the main witness is Chuck. It was an early Sunday morning in May of 1976, bright and sunny. Both men, of course, had the day off. So after having breakfast at the Totem Restaurant and Motel, which you can see here, they decided to take a drive out of town in Chuck's pickup truck. And they had no sooner turned onto the highway and were on the outskirts of town when they saw something in the field to their right about 150 to 175 feet away. You can see the area here. But as Chuck says, it was so bizarre that I made a conscious decision to concentrate on a couple of specific items so that I might recall these items later on. I fully realized at that moment just how unusual this was to my routine everyday sights, and nothing before lent any perspective. So I was just trying to instill common sense to the moments of this unique observation. And the object they were observing was clearly a craft, either landed on the ground or hovering just above it. They said it was oval in shape, about 30 to 35 feet in diameter, maybe 6 to 8 feet in height. And this craft was pink in color, with a shiny luminescence to it. They noticed a sort of hose-like band going around the perimeter circumference. And inside it, they could see these individual lights moving in a counterclockwise direction every 5 seconds or so. And wherever the lights were, they seemed to expand this hose-like band. Both men stared in absolute amazement and were even more shocked when they saw humanoid beings exiting the craft. As Chuck says, I saw a ramp drop from the belly of the craft, approximately 4 to 5 feet wide and 6 to 7 feet long. I observed 2 metallic extensions, which comprised at least part of the landing gear. Last, but certainly not least, I saw 2 small gray-green animals that looked like the stereotypical description of aliens. At the distance of 50 or 60 yards, I cannot provide any specific details, but they were about 4 to 5 feet tall and seemed to be in a quandary. I got a very distinct feeling that they were caught with their pants down and were in much of a hurry. Now, for some reason, Chuck did not stop the car. He just continued around the left-hand turn in the highway. But he did notice that his friend Patrick was continuing to watch the amazing sight, turning his head. And as Chuck says, I saw my buddy turning to look out his window as I continued around the corner, and perhaps 10 seconds later, sitting on the edge of the seat, he turned, staring vacantly out the windshield. His mind was very obviously involved with what he had just seen. So Chuck asked him, "Did you see what I just saw?" Patrick did not answer and just stared blankly ahead. So Chuck asked him again, and still there was no answer. So Chuck asked a third time, when his friend abruptly turned and looked at him and nearly shouted, "You're bleeping right, I did." But he then continued to stare blankly ahead with a faraway look in his eyes. So Chuck said, "Should we turn around and go back?" And Patrick shouted, "No!" Now, despite this, Chuck drove about 1/5 of a mile ahead, then turned around and went back. They immediately searched the sky and the ground for any traces of the object, but saw nothing unusual. There was one final aftermath to this encounter that left Chuck deeply dismayed. And as he says, my friend became increasingly unwilling to discuss the event after a few months. And these days, he refuses to acknowledge the entire experience. He says, "Geez, I don't remember." Not acknowledging reality when it is imposed upon us is, I'm convinced, some of the worst circumstances that we can impose on one another. It was 35 years after his encounter that Chuck decided to report his encounter to MUFON, writing that the details he submitted in his report he can say with, quote, great confidence. I do wish I could interview these witnesses directly and find more details about what they saw, but they certainly did describe it very vividly. It clearly had a huge impact on them. Such a shame that one of the witnesses doesn't even want to talk and now professes not to even remember it. This is not as unusual as you might think. Some witnesses do actually completely forget their encounters, and sometimes they just don't want to talk about it. It scares them so badly. An encounter, I've said this so many times, affects a person for the rest of their lives, affecting them on multiple levels, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So I certainly understand why some people might not want to talk about it. But other people absolutely feel compelled to share their experiences, and I'm really glad that this witness did. So let's move to the next case. This one is also really unusual. I call this one Not of This World. This one occurred on July 25, 1982, near Punta Umbra. This is in Spain. What I like about this case is the witness is actually really famous. I'm not sure that that adds any level of credibility to it, but it certainly adds a level of interest. This is technically a multiple witness case, although only one witness saw the landed UFO and humanoid. Many other people in the area did see UFOs on that same night. That definitely adds a level of credibility. But this case is interesting because this gentleman got out of his car, walked right up to this UFO and humanoid, and this is not your average humanoid by any means. The main witness in this case is Rafael Peralta. He is one of Spain's best-known bullfighters, or rejoneadores, which is bullfighting by horseback. In fact, Rafael, with his brother, developed, revolutionized, and popularized this sport. But what many people don't know is that Rafael Peralta had a very dramatic encounter with a landed UFO and an extraterrestrial being. His case was investigated by researcher J.J. Benitez and was also in the newspapers. It was about 4 a.m. on July 25, 1982. Rafael had just finished a bullfighting festival and was driving his Mercedes west along the A5052 highway, heading from El Rampido towards Punta Umbria in Spain, where his family was staying. Now this road traveled east along the coast, and he had just reached the intersection leading to Huelva and was heading along the beach towards Punta Umbria when his encounter began. As Rafael says, I saw several flashing lights, red and yellow, on the beach beside the road. I could not see exactly where they were. I stopped my car and walked towards them, thinking it could be a car crash and wishing to offer some help. When I was about 10 meters, 30 feet, from the accident, I discovered that there was a bright metallic object behind the light. It was like a large illuminated silver platter, a little bit oval, not exactly oval nor round, with blunt edges, I would say. So obviously this wasn't an accident. There was nobody else on the road at that hour, and now, seeing the strangeness of this object, Rafael started to become afraid. This object had a very smooth surface. There were no openings or protrusions. He estimated it was 6 meters wide, 18 feet, and 4 meters high, about 12 feet. It was hovering about 1 meter above the ground, or 3 feet. He started to cautiously back up towards his car, but this is when he noticed a strange figure standing directly in front of the craft. As Rafael says, in front of the object there was a strange, tall being clad in a metallic suit, like a spacesuit. It was 2 or more meters tall and very bright. I did not see arms, but it must have had them. It was not a robot. It was more human than robot. A very strange apparition indeed. He was tall. His head could have been a meter or so from the edges of the device. That is, he was about 2.5 meters tall. The guy was facing forward. His head was covered with something like a wire mesh, and I couldn't see his arms anywhere. There were no features, just a square, just like his body. It was similar to a rectangle. His legs were thin, almost cylindrical, and extended a foot below his groin. By now it was clear to Raphael that this being was not human. It couldn't be. Not only was it more than 7 feet tall, its outfit was unlike anything he'd ever seen. And as Raphael says, when I came closer, he emitted a noise, a guttural sound, like a short sentence. I was shocked and answered, "What did you say?" At this question, he ran away very quickly and entered the UFO on its left side. Immediately after, the UFO ascended and moved over the sea at great speed. At 15 to 20 meters high, it just disappeared. So Raphael later told investigator J.J. Benitez that the sentence he heard sounded like, quote, "Ba, ra, ra, ra." He said when it spoke, both the being and Raphael immediately retreated to their respective vehicles. He said when the UFO took off, it did so in perfect silence. Raphael himself had no problem starting his car, and he immediately and quickly drove to meet his family. And as Raphael says, "I went home, woke my wife up, and told her everything. But I did not want to tell anybody else, you know. They could laugh at me. That night I could not sleep because I was quite afraid." So reporters did later ask him how his wife reacted, and did she believe him? And Raphael told them, "Yes, of course. My hair was standing on end, and I was very much afraid. Of course she believed me." The next morning, he returned with his wife to the landing site, and they checked the spot but could find no evidence of the craft. And Raphael did intend to keep this entire experience a secret, but word soon leaked out. As Raphael says, "I told nothing to nobody, but after a few days I discussed the event with a lawyer, a friend of mine, whose brother is a local newspaper director. So that was how the event went public." So Raphael did read in the newspapers the very next day of his sighting that other people in the area and in nearby Cadiz also reported seeing a UFO. Apparently many residents saw it in the neighboring towns. Ultimately, Raphael remains completely convinced that he met an extraterrestrial being. As he told investigator J.J. Benitez, "For me, that was not of this world." I always find it interesting when skeptics dismiss a case and say, "Oh, it's purely anecdotal," or "this person was hallucinating," or "they probably just made it up and it's a hoax," or what have you. They weren't there, so it's very easy, I think, to judge someone else when you're not actually the person who had this experience. What a lot of skeptics don't realize is just how common this is. In this particular case, almost very nearly was not recorded. It was only by pure coincidence and happenstance that this witness even came forward. So again, the vast majority of people don't. If skeptics had any idea how truly common this was, I think they would change their tune a little bit. It's happening all over the world, as we see. That's why I like presenting cases from a wide variety of areas. And that case is really amazing. Now let's move to the next case, which I call I Continue to Wonder. This one occurred on October 27, 2010 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is a single witness case coming from a gentleman who had an encounter in his apartment in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This one is super interesting to me. It's got some really unusual elements. It's quite a long and extensive encounter, and he describes it in really vivid detail. I think you'll find it really interesting. This first-hand testimony comes from Carlos, that's a pseudonym, who reports a very unusual interaction with a UFO and what appear to be 3 or 4 gray aliens. It was the evening of October 27, 2010, and Carlos was lying asleep in his futon bed on the floor of his apartment in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he woke up suddenly to see bright-colored lights streaming in through the window in such a way that it seemed almost intentionally designed to wake him up. As Carlos says, "Suddenly I awoke and opened my eyes. Blinking lights from a source outside were reflected perfectly from outside the window at just the right angle to reflect onto the mirror propped against the wall behind me, and then reflected across the futon to the wall in front of me as I lay on my right side. I glanced up at the window and saw an aircraft hovering motionless in the sky, perfectly positioned for me to see it clearly from my position on the floor. It had many blinking lights of red, blue, and white, possibly yellow, similar to those of a police or emergency vehicle. The craft appeared to be in the shape of a boomerang. There were round balls of colored light equidistant across both wings, which appeared to blink randomly. There was no sound that I could hear. So never having seen any aircraft like that before, Carlos instantly wondered if it was an extraterrestrial craft. And at this point he sensed, but did not actually see, the presence of 3, maybe 4 beings in his room. The sense of their presence was unmistakable. But for some reason, he simply lay there. But then, in his mind's eye, he could actually see these beings. And as he says, I saw the image of a gray ET. And I telepathically heard, "We don't want to scare you." Before I could process this statement to respond, the gray lifted his spindly arm, and with an arc of his arm, and like the flick of a switch, I was out cold. At some point later, he woke up to go to the bathroom, and once again immediately felt their presence. Again, he did not react with fear, but felt strangely compliant. As Carlos says, I could feel them watching me, observing. I sensed that they had me arise to use the bathroom just to observe me, to see if I could go about this common routine. I felt as if they were scientists watching, whispering comments about my ability to carry out this routine task. I mumbled to myself as I returned to bed, annoyed that I didn't know what was going on, yet I was compliant in completing the routine. As I put my head on the pillow, I felt very sleepy, unable to keep my eyes opened. Carlos battled valiantly to remain awake and kept forcing his eyes opened, but the feeling of sleepiness returned, forcing his eyes closed. And this went back and forth until finally he couldn't resist it any longer. Later, he did open his eyes, and for the first time he saw one of the grays visibly face to face. And as Carlos says, I reopened my eyes and gazed at the window where I saw a small gray ET peering in the closed window at me. He was standing on the balcony just outside my bedroom window. I would estimate him to be about 3 feet tall. His large head was typical of the grays seen in pictures. His large, expressionless, solid black eyes stared at me. His nose looked like a couple of small holes with an almost non-existent mouth. He cocked his head to the left side in an inquisitive sort of way. His movement and the expression on his face appeared rather mechanical, as if devoid of emotion or any sort of deep thought. His affect and head movement was more robotic than organic. So once again, Carlos was overcome with sleepiness and shut his eyes, and when he opened them again, the gray was gone. But he did wake up in time to see an orb of white light zooming up from his apartment, out the window, up to the boomerang-shaped object, and actually affix itself to one of the wings, along with the other lights. Instantly the craft darted up to the left and was gone. And once again, Carlos was overcome with sleepiness and didn't wake up until morning. And when morning arrived, he felt fine and nothing in his apartment was out of order. And as Carlos says, as I got ready for work, I kept wondering where the craft and the grays came from, why they visited me in particular, and what did they do when I was asleep. I continued to wonder and would love to find the answers. That case definitely has details we see quite often. Quite a few people might not actually see the ETs at first, but sort of get a mental image. These ETs are very telepathic. They communicate telepathically, and that was clearly going on in this case. Also interesting to me is how he described being unable to remain conscious and fighting it, and actually succeeding at one point, but ultimately the ETs put him to sleep. He did not feel that they were there to hurt him or anything. They were there to observe. That's also interesting to me. The craft that he described, all of these little details start to add up because we hear them over and over again. Such a fascinating case. And now we move to another case, which is unusual in some ways that I've never heard before. This is technically a multiple witness case, although only one witness did see the humanoids. I call this one A Creature in Our Home. This occurred on October 22nd, 2015 in an undisclosed location in New York. And this one, I mean, you'll see why this is such an unusual encounter. Almost positive you haven't heard this one before, but it definitely deserves to be well known. This case involves an engaged couple. I'll call them Emma and Edward. Those are pseudonyms. And they report an encounter unlike any I've heard. It occurred on the evening of October 22nd, 2015, sometime after midnight. And as Emma says, my story begins with what seemed to be a very unusual lucid dream. I do not remember dreams often, and they are always typical dreams that change and morph. This was different. In my dream, I found myself standing in the hall bathroom doorway. I wondered how I had ended up there and why I was there, but my attention was quickly, somehow, pulled to my left backside. I turned my head over my left shoulder and I saw the view of my dining room. I noticed all at once that there was a gray-type looking creature crouched under my dining room table. Now there were normally 4 chairs around the table, but strangely one of the chairs appeared to be missing, and in the dream Emma was puzzled by this discrepancy, but her attention was immediately drawn back to this gray alien, which seemed to have a sudden telepathic link with her. And as Emma says, as he stared back at me, I felt what he was feeling, and he was angry. I knew he had been there for a while. He had not planned or wanted me to see him or know of his presence, and I felt his anger towards this dilemma. I could feel his fury growing. He was short and crouched, naked, with an enlarged head, and skin that I can only describe as seeming like shark skin. It was bluish, and it looked to be smooth, impervious, but textured as well. His shoulders leaned forward towards me, as though he were dramatically leaning forward with his hands on his knees. He had a pot-like belly and wrinkles around his almond eyes. Now the next thing Emma knew, she was back in bed with her husband Edward, and both were awakened by a huge crashing noise coming from the dining room. Edward leaped out of bed and rushed to check the room, while Emma tried to stop him and tell him about her dream. But by this point Edward was already walking down the hallway, so Emma followed him, and inside the dining room they found a very puzzling scene. As Emma says, he went and I followed from the bedroom to the dining room. The corner table had smashed to the ground, 2 legs broken off, although no pictures or vases on the table broke. It was even more strange that it seemed to be under the dining table. That's when we realized the dining table had moved a good 3 feet towards the wall with the corner where there is a window. This mystery soon deepened because this window is hooked up to an alarm. However, for the first time, their alarm system malfunctioned. This alarm system is controlled by an electronic tablet. However, when they tried it, none of the buttons would work. Nothing they could do would make this work. All of the windows and doors were still secured and locked, so there was no evidence of any intruder other than this broken table. But then, something even stranger happened. As Emma says, my fiancé was then drawn to the front window, and he said, "Let's look outside." And to our shock, 2 unusual and completely never before seen bright orbs hung ahead from our front door. We saw unusual hovering lights. We've never seen anything like this. They did immediately grab a camera and snapped several photos. They say that one of the photos does clearly show one of these orbs. Unfortunately, this photo, although they tried, is not included in their report on the case. That case is interesting to me in a number of different ways. One is that it starts out with what appears to be a lucid dream. But was it? Perhaps this lady was awake. She herself is not entirely certain, but absolutely made a point of saying that this was not like any other dream she's ever had. And the fact is, there's this physical evidence with the table being broken and alarm not working, and them actually seeing orbs right in front of their eyes. So clearly something was going on beyond just a dream. And also really unusual gray type ET as well. A fascinating case. Now let's move to our final case in this compilation, which I call I Felt I Was Being Tagged. This one occurred on October 6, 2023 in Olympia, Washington. This is another single witness case, but very recent. A number of you out there have asked for more recent cases. Well, here you go. And this guy had a very close-up sighting of a UFO and ETs, multiple UFOs, multiple ETs actually. One really interesting thing about this case is, for me, when it occurred. We often see people having encounters at pivotal points in their lives, and that's absolutely true in this case. The witness in this final case is Chris, that is a pseudonym. He was upset from having just gone through a recent divorce and decided to take a drive. And he was crossing over a bridge located at 794 Madrona Beach Road Northwest. You can see it here. This is over a tributary of the Puget Sound in Olympia, Washington. It was about 9:30 p.m., October 6. There were no cars on the road as Chris pulled over to vent his anger over being forced to move out because of his recent divorce. So he yelled out, and this is when something very strange happened. As Chris says, right after I yelled, I looked up and was struck in my head with a beam of electric current that sent a shock wave through my body. I saw red current flowing through my head and body. I started to mumble. Time went very slow, like being zapped and having time slowing down. So wondering what the heck was happening to him, he looked over to his side, over the side of the bridge to the water, and this is when he saw an incredible sight. As Chris says, I looked to the side over the lake bank, hovering about 20 to 50 feet off the ground, parallel to my view from the small bridge, about 100 feet away from me. I saw 3 gray aliens in 2 different crafts. One gray alien was in a 30-foot circular craft that was about 30 feet away from me at eye level to my height from the bridge, where the zap pulse electrical surge had come from. I glanced at the other 2 grays, who definitely heard my yell. They were in a triangular craft. I could see a panel of lit buttons in the craft as I was level to their height from my point of view on the small bridge. The triangular craft had to have been over 100 feet, because what I could see was just the front of the craft. The 2 gray aliens looked at each other in a sort of confused telepathy. When they looked back at me, I felt they were wondering, why am I yelling? Now my brain realized, wait, what? Holy bleep! These are gray aliens. What the F? I could tell they were doing telepathy because right after my thinking of these words, they felt like, oh crap, he knows, kind of a feeling from my observation. These objects made no sound at all that Chris could hear, and as he watched these 2 grays, one of them appeared to press a button on this panel, and the craft at this point seemed to dissolve and disappear. Weirdly, Chris could still see the outline of the craft hovering there, so it was like it cloaked itself, and actually watched the outline of this craft as it moved in a slow upward diagonal movement and was gone. Now in the days and months that followed, Chris felt as if he was somehow being tracked by these ETs. And as he says, I felt I was being tagged. Even 1 year later, he says he is still able to sense their presence. Pretty short case, and I suspect that a face-to-face interview with the witness would reveal quite a few more details. What's interesting to me is his feeling of being watched following this encounter. Like he said, I felt like I've been tagged. This is something many witnesses describe, that once they have an encounter, they have this ongoing connection with the ETs. Clearly they showed up for some reason. And as I said at the beginning, some people, when they have their encounters, it's during a really important moment in their lives. They might be going through a breakup, they might have just gotten a new job or moved, or going through some sort of spiritual awakening. And we see that in this case. So that to me is fascinating, because I think what's going on here is that the Greys are connected to these people and are coming for that reason. I am just speculating here, but we see it so often that clearly something is going on. There has to be a connection. I don't know. There's the facts. You can make up your own mind about it. But those are the 10 cases I've chosen for you today. I hope you found them interesting. I think this is such an important subject. Everyone in the world deserves to know about it. There's so many cases. There's far more evidence than certainly skeptics realize. And I think it's time that this subject goes mainstream and gets some real attention and study, because it's not going away. UFOs are a part of our culture permanently, and it's time we accept that. At any rate, thank you very much. I truly appreciate you guys tuning in every week. Hope you've enjoyed this episode and perhaps learned something. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun, and I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.